Hi, everyone, and welcome to part two of our conversation around root cause analysis. For those that haven't been able to listen to part one yet, although we highly recommend you do before this one, to give you an overview, we spoke about the importance of diverse perspectives and opinions. We went through some of the factors that go into that, why it's important, some of the kind of benefits of doing so. In this part, we're going to be talking about from diverse perspectives to meaningful action. So we've taken different views, we've gathered them. How do we turn those into, really identifying our cause or causes, and then, coming up with effective solution or solutions? But before jumping into the detail, for anyone who wasn't able to see part one yet, Ed, did you want to just provide a brief introduction to yourself?
Of course, George, and thank you. Yeah, my name's Ed Wells. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of a root cause analysis training and software specialist called What Caused This? And I've got something approaching a decade's worth of dedicated experience in the root cause analysis and complex problem solving space.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ed. So I'm much newer to What Caused This. I joined the family, only a couple of weeks ago. My background is in risk management within investment banks. And I'm super excited to be having this second part of our initial episode, our initial vodcast, in the hope that we're going to be doing more and sharing more of our ideas and perspectives with you all. So, Ed, in part one, we spoke about diversity of opinion that comes from having, both demographic diversity, cognitive diversity, having the right people in the room, providing the right level of challenge. What is it that you're looking to get out of part two?
Well, I think on part two, maybe we'll look at two things. At the very least, we'll look at barriers to success. What are the sorts of things that can derail that complex problem solving process when we're working together, and then ultimately what success looks like as well. So that'll be a nice way to sort of top and tail what was quite an in-depth first episode.
Yeah, and for me, very similar, right? I think one thing we started to talk about in part one, and we did touch on, was that cultural element, the psychological safety, the trust that is needed for people to feel safe to contribute. I guess, Ed, if I can ask a slightly leading question, it would be, where have you seen a blame culture maybe impacting the success of root cause analysis?
That's a very good question. I think you can take that question and get right to the sort of DNA of root cause analysis, because a lot of root cause analysis activity in the 20th century was born out of what they used to call organizational safety.
Mm.
And organizational safety, with its sort of grandfathers like Professor James Reason, a Brit at the University of Manchester, what the attempt to do was to move away from blame. So I'll give this a sort of cartoonish description, but before the organizational safety movement, in the world of root cause analysis, in the world of problem solving, you found when somebody deviated from the desired action, and in other words, you looked for fault, and that was the problem. So if somebody didn't follow a procedure or didn't use the right piece of equipment or wasn't behaving in a safe manner, that was your issue. You found your problem, and you would deal with that through what we might call blame and discipline. Now, I think you can recognize that in a way, you're only looking at a symptom there. The organizational safety movement said, well, actually, that person's a symptom of a deeper problem. The cliched saying, but it has a lot of value, is that actually when you found the person, that's when the analysis really starts. It's not where it stops. And I think there's an awful lot of truth in that. So you take that from the industrial example that I've given there, and of course it's easy to transpose that into every business, isn't it? Because if you have a focus on people and the actions that people undertake, good and bad, you are not looking at the other contributing factors. And every problem is fundamentally a combination of people, process, systems, equipment, and environment. And all of those have places where you can make changes. If you only deal with the person, there's a very good chance that all the building blocks of that person's error, if we want to call it that, are still there. So how long is it until the next person that you replace the previous person with falls foul of the same issues?
And I couldn't agree more. And I think often when we're talking as leaders about building target operating models, we frame our thinking around people, process, and technology. So therefore, why shouldn't we apply that same sort of, broadness or acceptance that actually when we look for root causes, we actually need to look slightly more broadly. We need to look at, the whole issue as opposed to, potentially finger pointing. And when we get to that point of accepting that we need to move beyond blame, we can actually start to uncover some truths that could be uncomfortable. I think there's a large degree of, all of us need to get comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. Ed, in your mind, how can getting that discomfort or having those uncomfortable, potentially conversations without blame then lead to stronger analysis?
Well, I think that essence goes back to a term you used at the start of this conversation, which is psychological safety. And thankfully, it's a term that is in greater and greater usage now, isn't it? I mean, I think it was a Harvard business professor, Amy Edmondson, who first coined the term, because we were all very aware of what physical safety is and where it plays its part, but the psychological safety, the confidence and safety to speak up. And this isn't just about whistleblowing; it's about constructive dissent and challenging, and not letting the hippo voice, as they sometimes used to call it, the highest paid opinion, rule the roost in conversations. And it's the subtle challenges around psychological safety that probably are the most pernicious over time. There's the constant sort of quieting of creative or dissenting voices. And you're right, those truths can sometimes be uncomfortable, but we do have to find a way that we can bring those out. Now, I think that a structured method like root cause analysis is one of the best ways to create a foundation of psychological safety, because if you truly adopt a root cause analysis way of thinking, which, going back to your point, looking at the event in the whole and recognizing that the actions of an individual or individuals are only part of the problem and that they were to some extent inevitable or could have been framed as inevitable, we then do take the onus off of individuals, and we move from a culture of blame more closely to a culture of accountability, or what is now often referred to as a just culture, where we're fairer. We recognise that to err is human, and we see it in the bigger picture. And if we can take that approach, I think root cause analysis is great for that, because you're also focusing on the process and systems and the culture and the environment, the KPIs, the targets, all of those things. And therefore every cause looks limited. Whereas if you take the approach that, we've got to find out who did this, then you're loading all the accountability onto a human. I mean, it's not a glib coincidence that we called our business What Caused This and not Who Did It. There's a very good reason for that.
And for me, you've touched on a few words and phrases there that set off some neurons in my mind, but it really is around having the right information, having the right, obviously, opinion. We spoke about the diversity of the people that are in the room, encouraging them to speak freely. But actually, one of the things that I find can be overlooked, but is so important, is when we've, come up with a potentially significant list of things that we want to talk about, not applying data and science and subjectivity to the information that we have in front of us. So it's looking at ways that we can take potentially dozens or hundreds of ideas and contributions, and then starting to apply some logic, some science, some data, so that it's not just us, using confirmation bias to lead us in a direction that we thought we were going to go anyway. Because as we start to narrow down our thinking into what was the cause or causes, what are the subsequent solution or solutions, being able to back that up with obviously people's opinions and perspectives and lived experiences, but also data and what that can tell us, is a really good way to start to narrow that funnel.
Yeah, and I would agree totally. I mean, there's all sorts of biases, isn't there? I mean, the hippo one, the highest paid opinion, is its technical term is authority bias. So that's another good example. But I think I like a phrase that was coined by the American economist W. Edward Deming, who said, "In God we trust, but everybody else needs to bring data."
Brilliant.
And his sort of saying there in his very American way was, show me, don't tell me. And I think this is why root cause analysis has been championed in new sectors in the last 20 or 30 years, because professional services, financial services, banking, etc. We've looked at other sectors that have become more reliant on data as their systems have become more complex, and those other sectors, engineering, manufacturing, power and energy, have reaped the benefits and in a way they've done the hard work for us. So we look at those sectors and say, well, look, let's learn something from them. We're not which isn't the same as mimicking them, but we've learned something from them, and let's become more evidence-based in what we do. RCA is historically a STEM technique. It is one that takes the engineering and process principles, and now we've been able to adapt it to different environments in service and in human behaviour. And there's been this happy marriage in recent years where the STEM framework has been able to support things like just culture and psychological safety in a way that we didn't necessarily anticipate when those parts of the Venn diagram first started to overlap.
Yeah, and so look, we've brought together teams of people to come up with suggestions and contributions and ideas and feedback, and so let's assume that we have that. When we're looking to bring that down into something actionable, because clearly what we don't want to be left with is too much, because then it becomes almost undeliverable in many cases. I actually like to find that disagreements should still be captured. They should still be framed as our almost decision assets, because it might be that we need to go through some sort of governance process to say, we didn't look at that, but why didn't we look at that? Not just because someone said it and everyone said, yep, forget that.
Yeah.
Let's explore why we're disagreeing and do that in a way where everyone's voice is being heard, so that we come up with the right actions. We can all stand behind them. And you and I have seen, Ed, right? We've worked in different industries, but probably the best way to create followership amongst your teams, your staff, your departments, is that they feel that they have a voice at the table, either directly or indirectly. It's being listened to, and then positive action is being taken based on what is being applied. That they can see that journey from idea and contribution through to action, and then the difference that's going to make to the business.
Absolutely. So if I think about the reasons why a root cause analysis project may not yield the deliverable outcomes that people wanted, there are fundamentally two reasons, George. One is the analysis was poor quality. Mm-hmm. So if you don't analyse an issue well, you miss things, or you oversimplify it, or whatever it might be, then inevitably that's going to be a major problem. But actually, in practice, that's quite rare. Often the analysis part of an RCA project is pretty decent. Where they more typically fail, in my experience, is the next step. It's about solutions. So everybody comes together and works together as a team to create the analysis, and then the solutions vanish off to some hidden management of change team or another department somewhere. The urgency is lost, the details lost, and it doesn't see itself through to completion. So you're right, that ownership is important. But linking this conversation with part one, and as George says, if you haven't listened to that, you should, is we talked about having those that sort of professional idiot or independent person contributing to the RCA in the analytical stage. That's also quite useful in the solution stage, because sometimes we can inadvertently create a situation where there's groupthink when it comes to solutions. And therefore, we ultimately probably need sometimes somebody from outside to say, yeah, okay, see your sweep solutions, but actually, as an outsider, have you thought about how difficult that might be to implement outside of the theoretical, or there might be unintended consequences if we don't do it in a particular way. I mean, you're a football fan, as you said. I always think the great example of that is the European Super League. I mean, there was a group of people very invested in that solution who all believed that they would, by force of will or whatever, would be able to sell that to the population at large. And they spectacularly failed to sell that idea. But they were intelligent and experienced and all believed they could, but they didn't come close. And probably anybody from outside of their bubble would have said, I really don't think that's the goer that you think it is. But they didn't need that, did they? Because they had the hubris to push on.
And I think of a financial services example that would apply in other kind of professional settings, and that's the very reason that audit is separate from the first and second lines of defence.
Yes.
So I've been involved in multiple audits in my time, whether that be facilitating or taking part in, being questioned. And actually, once you get beyond the defensiveness that can come with being audited, sometimes you actually find that the solutions that come on the back of an audit can actually be really meaningful and really helpful because, to use your term, the professional idiot. Obviously, I'm not calling anyone in audit an idiot, so please don't anyone think that. But you're independent to a certain extent. You don't have as much of the background. You're not working in that, team on a day-to-day basis. So you're able to help them identify risk, but then also come up with solutions that are going to actually address the challenge or challenges, the problems, the issues, the risks, rather than something that groupthink takes over and people, I know the answer, I'm going to go and, federate it out to my change team and they're going to get it done. Having that external perspective when you come to thinking about solutions can be really, really powerful and help you land in a better place than if you don't, or you're not able to bring in some element of external perspective.
Well, I mean, I think that's right. I think, I've got a very good friend who's a lifelong auditor, and he's very comfortable with that phrase, professional idiot. He lives and dies by it, because he says, I need to persuade the client that I don't really know anything about their business, and they need to go back to sort of brass tacks to sort of clear logic to explain what's happening. And he said, that's how I get to the truth, because otherwise we're just going to take shortcuts. But I get distracted there. What I would say, and I think this is not a coincidence, one of the most well told stories, and to some extent it's a little bit simplified and apocryphal, around problem solving is a story that you'll see in every other book on complex problem solving, and it refers back to the Second World War, when the US Air Force had their bombers in the European theatre based in the UK, and the attrition rate was horrendous, and they couldn't keep the fleet up to an operational number, because the German fighters, the Luftwaffe, were just so good at knocking these fortresses and super fortresses out of the sky. The story goes that the US Air Force leadership decided that they would run an audit. They'd do a survey on where their planes were taking the most amount of hits, and they would ultimately make those planes stronger in those areas. They put more armour on the most vulnerable parts of the planes. So that's exactly what they went and did. They did their surveys, and then they ultimately drew up a plan for where they'd make the changes in design. Now, to their credit, they ran their survey, their report, through a group of academics, we call them data analysts today, who worked at Columbia University under the leadership of a brilliant mathematician called Abraham Wald. And they showed them their work and said, this is what we found and this is what we're going to do. And Wald and his team came straight back to them and said, you really don't want to do that, which shocked them because they thought the work they'd done had been very diligent and they were very happy with the outcome. So, of course, they said, why do you say that? And Wald and his team said, well, look, all this survey about where your planes are being hit, just think about where you got the data from. And of course, they got the data from all the bases in the UK. And they said, well, of course, that data's not showing you where the planes are most vulnerable because your cohort of data is the planes that made it back. So that can't be where they're most vulnerable. You, in fact, don't have the data you need. That's in the English Channel under the sea or in a smouldering heap over Northwest Europe. And that is an example of, even at the solution period, reaching outside of your group and saying, look, help us out. Is this as a robust a solution as we thought it was going to be?
I think that's a great example, Ed. So if I recap what we've discussed in part 2, at the beginning we spoke about moving away from blame, which I think you and I are clearly is a passion of ours, talking about that.
You're never going to be able to get a full analysis if people don't share information. If root cause analysis is an engine for the truth, all engines need fuel. The fuel is information. If people aren't prepared to share that, then that engine will cough and splutter and stop. It's as fundamental as that, George.
Yeah. We then moved on to the power of constructive dissent. So how we can challenge ideas, potentially misconceptions, but also helping us funnel our ideas and, what people have put forward into, some of the things that we want to take forward. Hopefully we've, shone some light on how we might turn perspectives into action, but then also checking and challenging ourselves, potentially cognitive bias, bringing other people into discussions so that we can hopefully find ourselves in a better place with better solutions that actually address some of the risks and challenges we might be facing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. If your analysis is done well and has been comprehensive, you will have discovered causes that before you began that analysis you did not know about. And every cause is an opportunity to apply a solution. So the more causes you find, the more intelligence you have, and the more opportunity for successful solutions you're going to uncover.
Fantastic. Look, we want to thank everyone for tuning in to part 1 and part 2. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to listen to both. We'd be really keen to hear your feedback. We're not precious. We want to know what we've done well, what we could do better, and also if there's any topics that you'd like us to discuss. Ed and I are really keen to do as many of these as people would like us to do. So we'd be really keen for anyone to reach out, to leave us a comment, a DM. That'd be really great and appreciated.
I thank you, George. I'd say exactly the same. It's been a great pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, Ed. You too. And we'll no doubt talk soon.